Okay, everybody, welcome to part one of this discussion on the income tax enslavement. Yes, they've got us entrapped in so many different ways, don't they? The big wake-up call should have been in 1913. There's been a lot of times where there should have been a wake-up call, but so much damage could have been prevented right off the start. We could have cut them off right at the pass if this country woke up in 1913 when they passed not only the so-called income tax amendment, the 16th Amendment, but of course the Federal Reserve Act later that year, its little sidekick. Anyway, before we get into this discussion, I wanted to mention, as I did on my other channel yesterday, my friend, some of you have probably seen him comment on some of my videos here on this channel, Silas Speaks. He's got a really good channel of his own under that name, and it's one word, Silas Speaks, just one word, no space. Yeah, he's been putting some good stuff out, and I told him I'd give a shout out, for everybody to go check out his work. Particularly, he's got a series now he's working on called Blood on the Sand, the story of the Amorites, Hyksos, and Abrahamism, which is really, really good. So I encourage you all to go over and check it out and hit the subscribe button. Anyway, on to our discussion of the income tax. Yes, what an abomination that is on so many levels. Most Americans don't even realize that we didn't have an income tax in this country, or let's call it by its real name, a wage tax. We didn't have it until the 20th century, and almost the mid-20th century for average Americans. The groundwork was laid for it with the so-called 16th, so-called income tax amendment, the 16th Amendment, which didn't even accomplish what it was claimed it was supposed to do, right? It was just chicanery. But that was only enforced on small businesses, right? Never the big ones. They're the ones that implemented the damn thing, right? The Jew-run big multinational corporations, they never pay a penny in friggin' tax. Anyway, but it wasn't a problem for individual Americans until almost the mid-20th century, right? The World War II era. They snuck it on people sleazily by convincing them that, intimidating them into thinking that you won't be true Americans, true patriots, if you don't pay the wage tax, right? They called it the victory tax. That's how they lured them in. You want America to win the war, don't you? And it was only 5%, right? So people figured, well, it's not that much money, and yes, I want this country to win the war, blah, 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 blah. It was promised that after the war, it would be discontinued. In fact, they first introduced it as a voluntary thing. Well, it was always voluntary, but they introduced it as in such a way that you mailed in your little contribution, right? But after they got pretty much everybody on board with it, then they introduced automatic withdrawal. Oh, it's just for your convenience sake. Knowing full well that they never intended to remove the tax, right? They intended to keep it permanently. And, just like the Communist Manifesto calls for, to graduate it, right? Oh, yes, to raise the amount higher and higher. And within a generation or two, nobody questioned it anymore. They just figured, well, it's what we got to do. Everybody has to pay their fair share, blah, 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 blah. They tricked you into it. The fact is, and the IRS's own documents attest to it, it's still voluntary. Of course it is. It couldn't be compulsory. It couldn't be law because it contradicts everything else in the damn Constitution, right? Which forbids a direct tax, which is exactly what the frickin' income tax is. Can't get more direct than that, right? Your ability to earn a living is a sacred right that you have. And for them to come along and say, no, you can't earn a living unless we can get our mafioso cut, that, my friends, is extortion, baby. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In 1912, our good friend, Mr. Colonel Edward Mandell House, President Woodrow Wilson's chief advisor, a Zionist extraordinaire, a globalist extraordinaire, published a book titled Philip Drew, Administrator. In this book, he described, in the form of a novel, three main characters that, as it turned out, were actually representations of real-life figures, as was later revealed in the intimate papers of Colonel House, published in 1926. He admitted that the whole novel was based on what he knew was going to become reality, that he was going to be the middleman and manipulate the president in the interests of his buddies in the Zio pig bastard banking world, right? In Philip Drew, House was actually writing history a year in advance, relating events, again, that he knew would soon be played out in the real world at his hand. His novel portrayed Senator Selwyn, representing himself, who acted as a middleman between Wall Street and the White House. Very interesting book if you can get your hands on it. Selwyn, i.e. House, manipulated James R. Rockland, representing Woodrow Wilson, who he guided along the road to the presidency on behalf of a powerful financier, John Thor, representing Jacob Schiff. House relates in this book how Rockland, once elected as president, was manipulated to bring about, quote, socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx, and that this involved the creation of a central bank and a graduating income tax. Notice he didn't say communism, right? But that is what it is. Socialism is the twin brother of communism. In fact, socialism is really the open door leading to communism. The Jews created socialism as a means of fooling people into ultimately embracing communism. Remember the famous quote from Khrushchev? You Americans are so gullible, you won't accept communism, so we'll feed you with small doses of socialism until you wake up one day in a fully communist country and you will fall like ripe fruit into our hands and you won't even know how it happened, right? That's the Jew tactic. Little socialism here, little socialism there, and ultimately communism. If you won't accept an outright, in-your-face, overnight communist revolution, small dosages of socialism to get you there. And so this is what House was talking about in his novel, right? Perhaps not so surprisingly, Wilson once said of House, Mr. House is my second personality. He is my independent self. His thoughts and mine are one. It almost sounds like Mr. Wilson was a victim of MK Ultra mind control and that House was his handler, doesn't it? T. Coleman Andrews, former commissioner of the IRS, said in 1956, quote, I don't like the income tax. It's written into the Communist Manifesto. Maybe we ought to see that every person who gets a tax return receives a copy of the Communist Manifesto with it so that he can see what's happening to him. This was quoted in U.S. News and World Report, May 25th, 1956. A former IRS commissioner actually said that he didn't like the income tax because it was what? Right out of the Communist Fargen Manifesto, baby. All through history, Jews were the biggest crybabies about income tax. Why should I have to pay income tax? But the moment they exerted an influence, and they were always seeking to do that, right? The moment they exerted an influence in government, they saw to it that everyone else paid income tax, and a very exorbitant one at that, right? Oh, these evil bastards, man. As screwed up as our economy is, the devaluation of the dollar, massive inflation, blah, 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 outrageous cost of the bare necessities of life, all at the hand of Jews. Yet, how much easier this burden would be if people were taking home, as they should, every penny that they earned, right? Anyway, let's look at the 16th Amendment, shall we? The so-called Income Tax Amendment. The Supreme Court ruled in 1916 in Stanton versus Baltic Mining, a case that has never been overturned, that the 16th Amendment conferred, quote, no new power of taxation. Did you catch that? In spite of all the problems that exist with the 16th Amendment, which basically render it null and void, right? It wasn't even properly ratified. That's a whole long story right there. 2 volumes have been written on that subject alone. The Law That Never Was, it's called. But in spite of all that, it doesn't matter. Even if it was properly ratified, if you look at the wording of it, it introduces no new power of taxation, said the Supreme Court. Right? It didn't change anything. It didn't give the government new power to pick your pocket every week. It didn't. It doesn't have that power. It's never been given that power. The 16th Amendment certainly doesn't do that. Nothing else does. Nothing else could, unless the Constitution was officially rendered null and void. As long as the Constitution stands, the income tax is illegal, right? But so they chose carefully the wording of it just to give the appearance that it was changing things, but it didn't. It didn't. It would have to repeal several other parts of the Constitution if it did, right? In another Supreme Court case, Brashaber versus Union Pacific in 1915, it was ruled that, quote, the 16th Amendment, as correctly interpreted, is limited to indirect taxes, and for that reason is constitutional when properly interpreted and practiced, right? Which doesn't include the actual income or wage tax. The wage tax is illegal. The 16th Amendment does not give it any legal backing whatsoever. Says 2 Supreme Court rulings, and it's true. And for the reason that this quote just stated, it only endorses an indirect tax. It's just a redundant amendment that wasn't even needed in the first place when properly understood, right? It does not allow for a direct tax, which the Constitution elsewhere forbids. The 16th Amendment changed nothing. It only allows for an indirect tax, for example, taxation on, purchases, and has nothing whatsoever to do with taxation of wages of a resident citizen, a direct tax, which is unconstitutional. Imagine that. The highest court in the land twice has ruled that the 16th Amendment changed absolutely nothing. Why? Because it couldn't, again, since Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, and Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4 of the Constitution entirely forbid Congress from directly taxing U.S. citizens. They know this, the IRS knows it, and yet they still play this game with you. This is why people like Joe Bannister won in court against the IRS and proved before a grand jury that neither he nor anyone else is liable for the income tax. It's a monstrous, massive, whopping, in-your-face, God-damnable freaking fraud, folks. Every week, they suck 1/3 of your paycheck away from you. Before you even get it in your hands, your earnings are sucked away, right? That is a massive chunk of your earnings. And they have no legal precedent to do it. It's Jewish/communist criminality, thievery. Article 4 of the Constitution, Bill of Rights, presents another problem for the 16th Amendment being used to justify the income or wage tax. Notice what former IRS Commissioner T. Coleman Andrews, again, had to say on this matter. If the 16th Amendment has robbed you and me in the way it has been constructed and enforced, of the guarantee of privacy and the respect for our property that was given to us in Article 4 of the Bill of Rights. This invasion is absolutely, oh, I'm sorry, I read that wrong. If it does. No, he says it, the 16th Amendment. It has robbed you and me. I read that wrong, sorry. Yeah, it's robbed you and me, he says, in the way that it's been construed and enforced, of the guarantee of privacy and the respect for our property that was granted to us by Article 4 of the Bill of Rights. It does rob us of our privacy, right? Because
you have to have your books open to the government's inspection. Let me see now. How much money did you earn this week? Oh, you earned a little extra than what you reported. Why, we're going to fine you and take away the tax you withheld from us. And we might even throw you in jail for a few weeks.
Yeah, whatever. Blah, 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 right? What a monstrous, goddamn tyrannical system. You think you live in a free country? Guess again, baby. On this basis alone, you don't live in any free goddamn country when it's been made illegal for you to earn a living unless they get their cut. Think about that. Think about that for a minute. You have committed a felony? Really? You've broken the law. You have committed an illegal act for trying to earn wages to survive in this bitch system that oppresses you at every turn with an incredibly devaluated, fraudulent fiat currency, outrageous cost of living through the roof that nobody basically can survive in it anymore on their own, right? You got to shack up with 3, 4, 5 other people just to afford a frickin' single apartment, a single bedroom apartment where the other 3 or 4 are sleeping on the floor. You think this system is legitimate? You think it's free, do you? He went on to say, this invasion, of our privacy, of our rights, is absolute and complete as far as the amount of tax that can be assessed is concerned. Please remember that under the 16th Amendment, again, in the way that it's been, construed and enforced, Congress can take 100% of our income anytime it wants to. This is downright confiscation and cannot be defended on any other grounds. This is a former IRS commissioner, goddammit. Imagine that. The income tax is fulfilling the Marxist prophecy that the surest way to destroy a capitalist society is by steeply graduated taxes on income and heavy levies on the estates of people when they die. Yep. And they've already introduced that, right? The capital gains, eventually they'll so heavily tax you. There won't even be an inheritance anymore, right? Because that's another thing the Communist Manifesto calls for. Oh, they've been licking their chops over that one for a while now. And slowly but surely, they're inching their way to prevent you from inheriting anything. They're going to suck that all away from you too, folks. Communism. We've got the signs of it everywhere around us. We are, in fact, almost a fully fledged communist frickin' regime, right? They can call it a democracy all they want. It was never intended to even be that, was it, though? It was supposed to be a republic. But it doesn't matter. It's all window dressing. It's just a name game. It doesn't matter what they call it or what people think it is. Look how it runs. We live in almost a fully fledged communist system. Look at how all of your professors in all the major colleges and universities, they're all goddamn communists, folks. Your so-called elected, in reality, selected officials are all commies, aren't they? Jewish commies. Can any law or amendment that contradicts the Constitution, or that is construed or enforced in such a way that it contradicts the Constitution, be considered legally binding? To find the answer to this question, note the following. This is a quote from another Supreme Court ruling, Marbury versus Madison, 5 U.S. 2 Cranch, 137, 174, 176, and this was a ruling from 1803. It says, all laws which are repugnant to the Constitution are null and void. Just like the COVID jab mandates, right? Here's another quote along this line. This is from Miranda versus Arizona. 384 U.S. 436, page 491. Where rights secured by the Constitution are involved, there can be no rule making or legislation which would abrogate them. That's it. End of story. The bastards know this, and they've been lying to us ever since 1913. Well, they've been lying to us about a whole lot of other things, but, regarding the so-called income tax amendment, the wage tax, right? They've been lying, knowing that what they're doing is totally illegal. Norton versus Shelby County, 118 U.S. 425, page 442 says, an unconstitutional act is not law. It confers no rights. It imposes no duties, affords no protection. It creates no office. It is in legal contemplation, as inoperative as though it had never been passed. Here's another one. 16 Am Jur, American Jurisprudence, second edition, section 256 has this to say: no one is bound to obey an unconstitutional law, and no courts are bound to enforce it. There are so many rulings like this from over the years, folks, and yet you can't get more unconstitutional than the way the 16th Amendment has been interpreted and enforced, right? Therefore, the 16th Amendment does not, let me stress, does not give the IRS any legally binding authority to seize 1/3 of every American citizen's paycheck every single week. It's especially atrocious when you realize that a great deal of your tax dollars are used for things that are not only not in your interest, but are counter to your interests, right? How could you be compelled, yea, forced, to support things, to pay the bill for things that you have no say in, and that if you did, you would never allow them, right?
Just for one example,
the billions of dollars is sent over to that illegitimate state in the Middle East called Israel. Can you imagine? They're not only illegally stealing money from you, but they're using your money to pay for all kinds of illegitimate functions. Wow. Tell me, that's not taxation without representation, baby. So why, you may ask, was the 16th Amendment even written in the first place, since it changes nothing and has no authority to tax your wages, blah, blah, blah? Simply to create the illusion of a new authority to directly tax the wages of U.S. citizens, an illusion upon which the IRS still relies to this day. The IRS loves illusion games, right? Because the Jews who created it love illusion games. That's what everything they've ever created has been always based upon, right? Deception. We wage war by means of deception. The income tax is a very big part of the war that they wage against us, right? Just look at the IRS code, for example. Its mere size alone has served to discourage most people from ever even attempting to try to make any sense of it, right? Often it happens that different sections of the code completely contradict each other, while other sections are very obscure and difficult to follow, even for many IRS agents themselves. You have some people who specialize in certain areas, and when there's a question with another area, they got to call the other guy, and they'll get into arguments back and forth. It's more confusing than even the Bible. The code, of course, was designed this way, to overwhelm and confuse citizens into thinking that they're liable for something that they're not, right? Ultimately, it doesn't even matter how it's interpreted or how you think it's supposed to read or they're claiming it reads. In the end, any lawyer will tell you, right, that doesn't know that you can opt out of the system. They'll tell their clients, look, just pay it. I've been in this business long enough. I've had so many friends tell me this over the years. This is what the lawyers have told them. I've been in this business long enough to know you just pay them and get them off your back. You're never gonna, you're never gonna win with the IRS. Well, you can, but it's hell to pay after, right? Joe Bannister won, but they made his life a living hell in so many ways, sicking other government agencies after him. What a monstrous bitch of a system. You think you live in a free country until you start figuring out that the whole damn thing is a rigged game. And even though you have the law on your side and can beat them in a court of law, they're still going to make your life a living hell, right? To punish you for exposing them as the criminals that they are. Anyway, all the while that the IRS plays such manipulative word games, many of its own publications ironically state that it operates under a system of voluntary compliance. You will see this wording in their own documents. For example, former IRS Commissioner Mortimer Chaplin stated in the 1975 Internal Revenue Audit Manual, quote, "Our tax system is based on individual self-assessment and voluntary compliance." There you go. They're laughing in your face, right? They're telling you, yeah, it's all voluntary. You didn't have to do this. You don't have to fill out a 1040 or whatever, blah, blah, blah. It's all voluntary. It's an application. You only have to fill it out if you apply to do so, right? I mean, you don't even have to do it then, but only when you apply. That's what an application is. You apply, right? You apply for the Social Security number to enable them to track you of your own volition, of your own free will. Now, it's, parents don't even have to do that, right? They made that easy for you too. Just like before, you didn't, in World War II, later on, you didn't have to send your money in. We'll make it easy for you. We'll take it out for you. But it's still voluntary, right? If you never applied for it in the first place, if you didn't volunteer to give it to them, they wouldn't have been taking it out automatically. Same with the Social Security number now. Parents don't even have to apply.
We'll make it easy for you. We'll just give your child that number.
But it's still voluntary, right? You don't allow it, they can't track you. And you don't have to pay. Inherit your father's business, and they'll never contact you your entire life. They don't have your number, right? You didn't volunteer for their exploitation system. But everybody else who volunteered or got volunteered, yeah, they're going to pay because they've agreed, even though unwittingly, they've agreed to be exploited.
Sure, I'll play the game. After all, everybody else is playing it. I guess you gotta. That's just what we have to do, right? Gotta pay our fair share.
No, you don't. And it's nothing to be called fair, is it? There's nothing fair about it. Though this is indeed a unique admission that the IRS's income tax is based on voluntary compliance, the IRS, in fact, has to say this because it knows that there is no law that gives it taxation authority over U.S. citizens' paychecks. So legally, they have to say that. But the way it's all played out, though, they'll send a SWAT team to your door if you don't volunteer, right? Look how illegal, how fraudulent this whole goddamn thing is. Notice what the Supreme Court declared in 1875, back in the good old days, before we had the fraudulent income tax, in the case of Savings and Loan Association versus Topeka. Quote, to lay with one hand the power of the government on the property of the citizen, and with the other to bestow it upon favored individuals to aid private enterprises and build up private fortunes, such as what the IRS does today for the Federal Reserve, is nonetheless a robbery because it is done under the forms of law and is called taxation. Yeah? They're taking your money and giving it to their buddies on Wall Street, right? Or over in Israel, same thing. It's robbery. It is truly because of our ignorance and apathy, to a large extent, that the government is able to perpetuate this tax fraud against us. And all the other frauds, for that matter, right? They take advantage of your ignorance. Oh, did they ever do that under COVID, right? With this thought in mind, notice what the U.S. Supreme Court stated in the case of United States versus Manker. And I quote, "Because of what appears to be a lawful command on the surface, many citizens, because of their respect for what appears to be law, are cunningly coerced into waiving their rights due to ignorance." Yes, yes, yes. That's how the whole goddamn game works. It's how the whole system functions. In 1969, former Senator Henry Belmont made this astonishing statement. He said, "In a recent conversation with an official at the Internal Revenue Service, I was amazed when he told me, if the taxpayers of this country ever discover that the IRS operates on 90% bluff, the entire system will collapse." He. You know, somebody sent me a video a few years back of some IRS commissioner. I forget who the hell it was now at the time, but he was asked by a reporter. He said, "Sir, there's some people outside handing out pamphlets saying that the income tax is a fraud and that the IRS has no authority over our paycheck."
Oh, yeah, I'm familiar with all those silly arguments.
"But, sir, I read the pamphlet, and I was wondering if you could answer some of my questions." Well, he was trying to divert the thing. And he said, "Well, in a nutshell, could you just tell me what law makes us liable to actually pay the income tax?" And he was stumbling over his own tongue, right? He didn't know what the hell to say. All of a sudden, this woman behind him, this little bitch sidekick of his, stands up and grabs the mic.
All of that information is on our website. You can go and read it.
He says, "Well, if it's there, you ought to have it off the top of your head. Could you just tell me specifically what law?" She didn't answer him. She just said,
Go to the website. Go to the website.
Wow. Wow. They can't answer because there is no answer. There is no law. There never has been. How do you like them apples? The fraudulent income tax doesn't just rely on ignorance, though. There's another big factor that enables it to persist. Fear. Santo Presti, former Treasury agent, once said this: "Fear is the key element for the IRS in achieving its mission. Without fear, the IRS would have a difficult time, a difficult time maintaining our so-called system of voluntary compliance." Fear. Former IRS District Chief David Patno, got the hiccups. David Patno once said, "More taxes collected by fear and intimidation than by the law. People are afraid of the IRS." Yep. When you don't have the law on your side, you have to have the threat of the SWAT team coming to your door, right? They know they can't beat you in a court of law when you actually know what the law states. Kind of makes me think of when I was in college, right? They didn't want to debate me, and they never did. Well, the only time there was a debate, a discussion, was behind closed doors when they only allowed 6 pre-selected lackeys to attend. I wanted the whole college to be there, right? And they told me to uninvite everybody I invited, and if anybody showed up other than the ones they selected, they were going to cancel the meeting. Blah, blah, blah. They don't want to be under the spotlight, right? Just like the IRS. They don't want it to go to court. They don't want the jurors to see that they're lying. They don't want people to look at what the law actually says. So they send the SWAT team to ensure compliance.
Voluntary compliance.
You can always tell tyranny when it runs like a cockroach when you shine the light on it, right? Anyway, several U.S. presidents, such as Nixon and Clinton, have capitalized on this fear of the IRS to intimidate and silence political opposition. The January 25th, 1997 edition of Technopolitics, the TV news magazine of the Public Broadcasting Service, PBS, reported that the IRS was, quote, aggressively auditing conservative public policy groups who oppose the Clinton administration's policies. Imagine that. The IRS has often been used as an attack dog against people who go against, certain presidential mandates, right? Presidential, policies, programs. In such cases as this, it doesn't matter that there's no evidence of tax evasion. They'll just go after you with that phony claim, right? And like so many lawyers have said,
just pay it, just pay it. You clearly don't owe anything, but just pay it anyway because they'll make your life a living hell.
They'll add interest every day and it'll just compound and they'll claim you owe them 3 times what the original amount is. It's not worth fighting them. Yeah, that's what you got to do when you don't realize you actually have the law on your side. The only way to really get them off your back, and that's no silver bullet either necessarily, because they can just arrest you, and they have, right? People who knew the system was a fraud have still gotten arrested and gotten locked away, right? They did that with Traficant. They did that with, I can't stand this guy. He's such an obnoxious pain in the ass. But, what the hell's his name now? Kent Hovind. Are you guys familiar with him? The Bible-banging, frickin' obnoxious little... Nevertheless, as much as I can't stand him, he was correct. Is correct about the fraudulence of the IRS tax system, right? So when he would go around giving his talks, his Bible-dupe creationist talks, he would also talk about the tax system, what a fraud it is and how he didn't pay, blah, blah, blah. But did that stop the IRS ultimately from arresting him and locking him up for 7 years? No, they did. They arrested him on tax evasion, even though he had the law on his side. So there are people who have gotten out of it, yes. But let's be realistic about it. It's not a silver bullet, right? It's not going to guarantee that the tyrannical system isn't going to sink its teeth into your flesh. Joe Bannister never went to jail, but they did make his life a living hell in so many ways, right? Trumped up fake charges and so it was with Hovind, right? He was right. He had the law on his side, but that didn't stop him from arresting him and locking him away for years on end. So, there are ways out, but in the long run, if they want to screw you over and make your life a living hell, they're going to do it anyway. Doesn't matter that the law isn't on their side. That's what criminals do, right? Anyway. So yeah, when the IRS wants to target someone, it simply makes up false evidence just to entrap the troublemaking target. They do this when they audit people all the time, right? They'll claim that you owe for this, owe for that. And then when you can even show them your papers that everything's above board, you're not hiding anything, it doesn't matter. I had a friend that this happened to. You know what they did? The IRS admitted, oh yeah, okay, oh yeah. But they still claimed that he owed them half the amount. So it dropped from 6,000 down to 3. And his lawyer said, look, just do it. Just pay it. Be glad that they cut it in half. You don't owe him anything, but just do it, right? You're not going to go anywhere. That's what the lawyer said, because he knew how they worked, right? So yeah, he lost out on $3,000 when in fact he had been paying them an illegal tax to begin with, right? Can you imagine? The whole year long, he's letting his paycheck get sucked dry, and then they claimed that he owed him even more when he never owed him anything in the first place that they had been stealing. Folks, it's such a goddamn abomination, man. My blood boils just thinking about it. What these sons of bitches get away with. And who do we have to thank for this? The The same ones we can thank for all the other miseries in this fraudulent system of ours. But the truth is, the IRS is also afraid of us finding out the truth about the fraudulence of the income tax. As a case in point, in section 5221 of the Internal Revenue Manual, titled Returns Compliance Programs, we find this warning for IRS agents. It says, some techniques of tax collection can be used only in connection with a full-scale program due to the nature of the tax situation and a need to avoid unnecessary taxpayer reaction. Imagine that. They're warning the IRS agent, we want to avoid unnecessary taxpayer reaction. We don't want it to have to go to court. We've already had problems with that in the past. It's not coming out and laying it out that way, but that's exactly what the meaning is behind this statement, right? We want to avoid any court action against us because we can't defend ourselves. Yeah. That's what the nature of the tax situation is, that it is in fact a fraud and doesn't have the law on its side. Foreseeing the dangers of the passage of the 16th Amendment roughly 3 years before it was passed, Richard E. Byrd, Speaker of the Virginia House of Delegates, voiced the following prophetic words of warning and opposition. Listen to what he said here. This amendment, the 16th Amendment, will extend the federal power so as to reach the citizen in the ordinary business of life. A hand from Washington will be stretched out and placed upon every man's business. The eye of a federal inspector will be in every man's counting house. The law will, of necessity, have inquisitorial features. Yeah, like the Inquisition, right? It will provide penalties. It will create a complicated machinery. Under it, businessmen will be hauled into courts distant from their homes, and thus won't have any peers as their jurors, right? Heavy fines imposed by distant and unfamiliar tribunals will constantly menace the taxpayer. An army of federal inspectors, spies, and detectives will descend. Yeah, look at what Biden did, right? 80,000 frickin' heavily armed IRS agents. Really now? That's not tyranny, is it? And yet all the while, they want to take away your right to bear arms, right? And yet here they are. Do you see why? One of the reasons why, right? So armed IRS agents can come to your door. You don't have a gun to defend yourself now. They can take whatever the hell they want, and you can't resist them. You see why we have all these school shootings now? Not just for that, for other reasons. They don't want you to defend them when they impose martial law or force you to take a toxic jab into your veins. And on it goes. He went on to say, they will compel men of business to show their books and disclose secrets of their affairs. They will dictate forms of bookkeeping. They will require statements and affidavits. When the federal government gets a stranglehold on the individual businessmen, state lines will exist nowhere but on the maps. Exactly. Its agents will everywhere supervise the commercial life of the states. Exactly. And that's just where we are, isn't it? This is not a free country, folks. Oh, not by a long shot. Just on this basis alone, you can show it's not free in so many other ways, right? But just in regards to the IRS, look how oppressive, how abominable, how tyrannical this bitch of a system is. And it's totally fraudulent, totally illegal, totally unconstitutional, right? And even though the Constitution has its problems, it's very clear about taxation, right? Forbidding a direct tax. It's not obscure when it comes to that. There have actually been many IRS employees over the years who have woken up to the fact that the income tax is illegal and consequently left their job with the agency. Again, one such person is Joe Bannister. On March 26, 1999, WorldNet Daily reported on his awakening experience in an article called IRS Special Agent Challenges System, which stated, quote, "The Internal Revenue Service is everything the so-called tax protesters said it was: non-responsive, unable to withstand scrutiny, tyrannical, and oblivious to the rule of law and the U.S. Constitution." Can you believe this? This was actually published by WorldNet Daily. All true. Then it goes on to say, that's how Joseph Bannister, a certified public accountant who, until last month, was an investigator and gunslinger for the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS. So everything they said in the previous paragraph is true, but now they're covering their tail by saying, that's how Joe Bannister sees it. But that is, in fact, how it is. He said he now regards his former employer this way, as tyrannical and not following law. His conclusion is based in part, it said, on a personal 2-year investigation into the agency's history and purpose, an investigation that he began somewhat reluctantly, never expecting that he'd reach the conclusion that he did. His research led him to question its very legality and constitutionality. Deeply disturbed by his discoveries, he summarized these in a report which, in February, he sent to his supervisors and asked them to respond to these allegations, even though WorldNet Daily was kind of watering things down, or not watering down, but backing away and not making any definitive statements or confirmatory statements. It doesn't matter. At least they gave him a voice, right? This thing went national, right? You got to give him credit for that. Anyway, here's the points he wrote in his letter. That the filing of federal income tax returns is voluntary, and the filing of federal income tax returns is not required. Number 2, that the 16th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was never ratified, and it didn't change anything either. And again, yes, it never was ratified. You can read about this in a fascinating 2-book series that I mentioned earlier called The Law That Never Was: The Fraud of the 16th Amendment and Personal Income Tax, written by Bill Benson. If you can get a hold of that 2-volume set, it's quite the read. But in order for any amendment to be properly ratified, all the copies sent out for ratification have to be precise, right? There can be no difference in the wording or even in the punctuation. And yet, when you go back and look, as he does in the book and shows, every copy was different. The wording was different. The punctuation was different. So on that basis alone, the ratification isn't even legitimate, right? But it doesn't matter. Like I said, guys, it doesn't matter. Even if the damn thing was ratified, you look at the wording of it, it didn't change anything. Anyway. Number 3 in his letter, that income taxes are not used to pay for daily government operations, but to pay the interest on the national debt. Yeah, that's true. I mean, your dollars ultimately do fund these programs, but indirectly. The government just takes loans from the Fed to fund stuff, and then they turn around and zap you with taxes to pay back that debt plus the interest. Well, the interest is so high now that you never touch the principal, right? All we're paying is the interest on the debt, the fraudulent debt. Anyway, what kind of response do you think that Bannister got from the IRS? WorldNet Daily quoted these opening words of the response letter. The Internal Revenue Service will not be responding to your request and will provide you with the necessary paperwork to tender your resignation. This is what his supervisor wrote. That was it. They're not going to respond. We'll just accept your resignation, but we're not going to respond to your questions because they can't. The article went on to say, Bannister says that he was astonished and confused at the response, or rather the lack of it. After all, he had worked for the agency for years. He believed his allegations were serious enough to warrant a response. Even a personal plea to Commissioner Charles Rosati himself wasn't enough. His career as a special agent was so much dust. What do you suppose became of Mr. Bannister? On November 18th, 2004, he was arrested for, you guessed it, tax crimes. He was later released after paying out a handsome $25,000 bond. They couldn't answer his questions about what makes a person liable for paying the fraudulent income tax, but they arrested him anyway. This is nothing but pure harassment and intimidation. It's thuggery, folks. Government thuggery. But he's actually one of the lucky ones. Usually they send in a SWAT team that results in the person either getting sent away for years or shot to death in the process. It's all part of living in a free country, of course. How dare you want to keep your income for yourself and not let us steal it from you illegally? On June 23rd, 2005, Bannister was acquitted. He was found not guilty of all charges launched against him. In other words, the IRS couldn't prove its case. Of course it couldn't. But don't worry. The IRS are a bunch of relentless bastards. They just sicked other government agencies on him ever since, right? Just to punish him and send a message to others. If you try to go down this road, we're going to wreck your life like we did to Joe Bannister. It's so abominable. Anyway, we're just about at the hour mark. This is a good place to stop. All right, guys, thanks for joining me. Lots more to come on this topic. We'll catch you in the next video. Take care.